think so. Can you hear me?
All right.
I can't see you in the back, but can you hear me in the back? Okay, great. So when I was 20, it was my junior year of college, and I'd just come back from my first research internship ever in Alaska. And I was feeling really, really smart. I didn't screw anything up that summer, but I was also feeling really, really unattractive. I'd gained 15 pounds that summer, and I'd gone through a breakup with my first really serious boyfriend before I'd gone to Alaska. So I wasn't really feeling that great about myself in terms of men. But I met this woman, Sarah, who was a year above me, who's also a biologist, and she sort of took me under her relationship wing, and she's like, let me tell you all about dating men. I was like, okay, I need some help here, especially with the extra weight going on. So she starts taking me to this coffee shop. This is in Providence, and we start hanging out with some of the baristas, and she introduced me to this guy, Ian, who's this tall, lanky redhead, who's a barista, who is 25 and working on his novel, and New York had already broken him, and, you know, he was so interesting and mature. I was 20. But he also agreed to go on a date with me, so he was very attractive. And so on one of our dates, we start sort of rehashing about our sexual histories and my issues, and then he starts to tell me he's getting really nervous, and he's like, well, you know, I actually haven't had sex successfully in kind of a while. And I was like, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, I had this accident. And I was like, well, what happened? I'm a really understanding person too, by the way. He's really mature and interesting, and I want him to like me. And I'm really lonely. And so he tells me, he's like, well, I had an accident during sex where I broke my penis. Which can happen, guys, if you haven't heard of this. It's very possible. Involved a trip to the ER. I don't remember the particulars on the angle or the position that was involved, but he had a lot of anxiety about sex and having sex successfully. And I was like, well, you know, whatever. We'll just see what happens. And so I think it was either that date or the next one, we went back to his house. And, of course, someone as mature and adult like Ian doesn't even have sheets on his bed. I was 20. So we do have sex successfully, right? Nothing goes wrong. He's very happy about it. And I tell my friends Dan and Bucky about this. And Bucky, who's a year ahead of me, he was going to go on to divinity school to be a Unitarian minister. And I knew them from the Unitarian group I was in, so we talked about sex all the time. And I tell them this story, and they're like, you are the miracle worker. And Bucky says, when I have my own congregation, I'll have you come to one of my sermons and say, behold the miracle worker. She cured erectile dysfunction. And that was all well and good, but after Ian and I slept together, he didn't seem all that interested in seeing me very much anymore. Like, only kind of casually, and he's sort of reluctant to see me maybe more than once a week. And I was like, okay, well, I'm a mature 20-year-old. We don't have to be committed. We can just like date casually, and maybe we can see other people. But if you're seeing other people, you need to tell me about it, just so I know what's going on, since we're really mature adults here. So New Year's Eve of that year, I'm hanging out with my friend Joe. Now, my friend Joe, Park Ranger Joe as I called him, we had met working on a nature reserve a couple years ago, and he went to the school nearby. And I had introduced him to Sarah. It almost ended up being an accidental repayment for being introduced to Ian. And they had started dating, but I knew full well that Sarah had not been necessarily very honest with Joe yet about her sexual history, which I had some moral qualms with. So Joe and I start talking about Ian, and I'm supposed to see Ian later that night, supposedly, and Joe starts to get a little uncomfortable, and he's like, well, Sarah doesn't want me telling you this, but Ian's been seeing other people. And I was like, well, Ian didn't tell me that. And I told him specifically that if he was going to see other people, he was going to be a mature adult and tell me about it. And I was like, what do you mean Sarah didn't want you telling me? And he said, well, Sarah didn't want you to get upset. So she told all of our friends not to tell you about Ian sleeping with other people. And I was fucking livid. I was like, how dare this girl that's supposedly my friend start controlling my sex life? I mean, it reminded me of like this boyfriend that lied about dying of cancer in high school, and my supposed best friend growing up that tried to convince me I was raised by squirrels. And I was triggered. I was like, how dare she? And so out of my mouth came like her entire sexual history and everything like crazy she had done and ever told me, and how many guys she slept with and STDs and all this stuff. And I just tell Joe all this, and I'm like, if you're going to start dating her, you need to know all this stuff anyway because you're my friend. And I realized that what I had done was really just sort of vengeance, but it was out of the bag. So that was New Year's. I never returned Ian's calls. And the next morning, I wrote this angry note and left on his door. It said, you just used me to get over your erectile dysfunction. And I left it on his door and never really talked again. He sent me some angry text messages. But so Joe told Sarah what had happened and about everything that I had told him. And they decided that Sarah hadn't done anything wrong. She had been just protecting me this whole time. And so she was being a good person. And that although what I had told Joe ironically brought them closer together, I was terribly in the wrong and she had done nothing wrong. And so they were like, you need to redeem yourself. You need to go through redemption with us. And I was like, hell no. Sarah needs to apologize to me too. And we went back and forth for, I think, like 4 months. And then I think Sarah and I finally had words to like formally apologize. But Joe decided he didn't want to be friends with me anymore. We were done. We were no longer ranger buddies, nature preserve buddies. It was over. And so I lost a really good friend, actually. But 8 years later, on Facebook, I got a message from Joe. And he's like, as I'm sure you know, Sarah and I are getting married next week. And I was thinking about our origin story, and we would never have met if it weren't for you. And I'm really sorry about being immature 8 years ago. And I reply, I go, okay. And he goes, okay, that's it? And I was like, well, I didn't know that you were getting married, but I'm listening. And he's like, well, that's very sciencey of you. So I think I took a few minutes, and I was like, look, like, it was a really long time ago. It didn't totally screw up my life or anything. And you guys should, go get married and have babies, whatever. I don't care. That's great. And he's like, okay, but I just want you to know that I think you're a really awesome person too. And that everything you've done with your life with science and everything is really good. And I'm really, really sorry. And so I said, I hope you have a really great wedding next weekend. Thank you.